To sum up the life and work of British artist Genesis Breyer P-Orridge is close to impossible. Not only because of the wide range of artistic disciplines, but also because of the time span, since the mid-1960s to the present day, that has been saturated by hundreds of records, thousands of concerts, exhibitions, interviews, videos, spoken word performances, collages, sculptures, philosophy, cultural engineering, occultism, and radical transgender concepts. A couple of descriptions are still valid after these 50 years of active creativity and provocation. P-Orridge is a romantic existentialist and a cultural engineer. Everything is both work as such and seed for cultural and behavioural change.
What am I about? Well, as you probably are very aware, it changes as long as you go on. What you're about changes. I guess one of the main themes is change itself. The question that completely obsesses me all the time is, are human beings capable of actually changing their behavior? And if they're not, then obviously we're doomed as a species. And as Brian Geisen would say, we're just clever rats. But there's so much evidence that we're better than clever rats that we keep on having this, who knows what motivates it, but some kind of optimism that it's worth trying to look for methodologies, tools, examples, anything, even just a brick with a sharp edge, anything that might just get people to stop living lives of behavioural loops and thoughtless activities. And that they finally say, as most of us do, but in a really sincere way, what the hell am I doing here? Is this real? What is happening in what we call existence? And what is the rest of this species doing to itself? So those are one of the main themes. Over the years it's got more spiritual and less aggressive, if you like. Sort of back in the 60s and 70s it was the sort of basic strategy was just attack everything, smash anything that smelt of hypocrisy, expose people who were lying to the rest of the world, and try by shock to cause them to think. But now it's much more complex than that. Culture changes, politics changes culture, economics change, all the great ebbs and flows of what we've called civilization change. And as they do, so do the strategies of what we've come to believe is the job of what we might call an artist. We prefer to say creator, not with a big K, with a little k. Back in the 60s, we came across, of all things at school, we were in the English class, and my teacher called me up after one of these boring classes about Shakespeare, and he said, you know, you seem to have a very different kind of cultural reference to most of the people I know. Here's the name of a book that I think you might really enjoy reading if you can find it. And he'd written down On the Road, Jack Kerouac, which at that time we'd never heard of. And then a few weeks later, my father brought it home. He'd found it in a motorway cafe in a sort of a cheap bin of, bargain books. And that led me into the whole beatnik ethos. And that's something that's also part of how we work, which is we'd already discovered Dada and Surrealism and come to the conclusion that art wasn't really what we were fascinated by, but the people who made it. That the lives of the artists, the lives of the writers, to me, were at least equally as exciting as any object they made or book they published. That in fact that was what drew me to certain things. Most of what Andy Warhol makes I don't really enjoy at all, but the fact that he set up the factory and had all these interesting people coming through and kept a constant state of stimulation, that's interesting. And while we were looking at those people, the beatniks, we came across William Burroughs and Brian Gysin and read about their experiments with cut-ups, which began purely as a sort of, one accident isn't the right word, but Brian Gysin was cutting through some images, photographs, in order to use them for something, and then noticed underneath he'd sliced up a magazine or a newspaper. And when he started just idly moving the bits around and then reading across, he found that the words and phrases and sentences were just fascinating and really unusual and stimulating, and surprising collisions were happening. And there was a sense almost of a meaning that couldn't be found any other way. Something was going on. There was something there that was very profound. And so he told Burroughs about it, and Burroughs started to experiment with it too, mainly with writing, and also felt that this was one of the only ways to break down linear thinking, to break down conditioned thinking, to break down inherited ways of thinking. Once you start to chop things up and just assemble them at apparent random, you've removed the element of conscious direction. And so you get things happening, you get things interacting, words, images, sounds, that could never, ever meet each other any other way. And if you're opened up to that, you start to see the world that way too. You realize that it's happening constantly, that as you're sitting here talking, there's somebody in the background drilling, there's birds outside twittering, there's cars honking, there's people breathing, somebody over there's fucking, somebody over there's dying, who knows? But nothing is as it seems. And if nothing is as it seems, then this is all potentially just a hallucination. So cut-ups became really central to the way of seeing the world and became absorbed into everything that we did. And what you find happens is that your brain starts to accelerate its comfort with cut-ups. It becomes more and more opened up to seeing these collisions in the most unlikely places.
If there is one artistic constant in P-Orridge's life, it is poetry. Starting out as a young poet in 1960s Hull in northern England, the poetry has permeated musical lyrics, experimental writing, art theory, magical treatises, and spoken word performances, as well as seeping into other disciplines such as music and collage making, and into P-Orridge's own philosophy of life.
Cut yourself up. See who you really are. see who's really there. The more detached one is from a role in someone else's script, the easier it becomes to create a new one. Is this you? Is it? Is this contrived character you? Who is directing you? Who's directing who? There are more than one of you. Choose another you. Start shooting. Shooting your own script. Every man and woman is a man and woman. We started to do performance art in the 70s as COUM transmissions. And as that went on, it went from being pretty much street theatre and provocations, just surprise things happening in unlikely situations. But as we went on, it got more and more fascinating for me, thinking about why are people surprised and why is it so powerful to suddenly be naked in the middle of a theatre piece or a performance or whatever it might, or an action. Who decides? It still makes me laugh to see people in the street. It happened today. We saw some young girl in a very short skirt constantly pulling it down, even though she was wearing white, long, not even tights, but more like long johns underneath. But she was pulling this skirt down, pulling it down. So there was this contradiction, like she wanted to reveal as much as possible, but not reveal anything. And yet that same person on a beach, with the permission of being on a beach, would wear the minimum possible clothing and feel totally okay about it. And all the men that they were so afraid of seeing their underwear when they were pulling their skirt down are just dismissed as irrelevant. There's a strange disconnect. Who makes the rules? Where are these lines drawn? And who draws them? About what is appropriate, what is not appropriate.
After having left the experimental commune Transmedia Explorations in 1969, P-Orridge founded the performance art collective COUM Transmissions. The group performed all over Europe and was also active within the Mail Art and Fluxus networks. P-Orridge corresponded exhaustively with artists around the world and became well known for a satirical and provocative attitude. Some collaged postcards displaying the Queen of England in the midst of softcore pornography led to a court case, in which American author William Burroughs spoke up for the artistic merit of P-Orridge's works. An exhibition at London's prestigious Institute of Contemporary Arts called Prostitution led to an outraged media attack. This show included pornographic photos of P-Orridge's girlfriend at the time, among many unconventional things such as used tampons, syringes, and COUM press clippings. COUM transmissions broke new ground for what was artistically possible in a very conservative and easily provoked Great Britain.
We don't like the idea of being trapped in that little bubble of the 70s. We're aware that it was the gap. There's always been, until recently, a huge era in art history where the 70s were basically ignored, because Mail Art and Fluxus and even Joseph Beuys talking, all these things were basically ignored because they couldn't fit them into the isms. And it's only in the last 4 years that they've actually started going back and filling in that gap. They did a big show at the Barbican, and it had Lee Bowery in it, and it had Gilbert and George, it had COUM and so on. A lot of the people actually used to have spaces at 10 Monticello Street, which was interesting. So they've started to reassess the 70s. And we see it as a vindication, but you know the way we work, it's always what's next, what's in the future, how do we do something further along. And so having them treading on the tail is sort of a mixture of pleasure at being accepted on some level, even tiny level, but also annoyance that they don't want to move to the front and ask the mouth what it's thinking.
Out of the remains of COUM transmissions, Genesis Breyer and Peter Christopherson created the band Throbbing Gristle, or TG. This was at the height of the punk era, in which a do-it-yourself attitude ruled supreme. Throbbing Gristle formed their own record label, Industrial Records, and started releasing their own and other radical people's records. This was a very far cry from the punk scene, which was always rock-based. TG's music was experimental, weird, dark, like a mix between soundtracks from low-budget horror films and avant-garde electronic music. The performances were often consciously held in unexpected places, like boys' schools, art colleges, and cinemas. P-Orridge's intellectual strategies, existentialist poetry, and behavioural Cutups were integrated into everything. The influence of Throbbing Gristle and Industrial Records has since been enormous on the musical underground.
How do we change ourselves from something that's that ingrained in every different culture? How do we find the unifying factors? And how do we let go of the fear of the differences and start looking for the things that are similar without staying afraid? But what if we're trying to be nice and look for what's similar, but they're secretly going to attack us anyway? Paranoia. And one of the things that we came up with Cutups was, during some of the more extreme things that we did towards the end, personally, we found ourselves going into altered states, mental altered states, sort of out-of-body experiences, talking, speaking in tongues, finding it impossible to feel pain, swallowing things that were poisonous and not being damaged by them. Different things that we'd read about in so-called primitive cultures. And we thought, there's something really interesting happening here. And it has something to do with putting pressure on the body of stressing the body in certain ways, exhaustion. Lots of people, if they fight being exhausted for some reason, will notice that they can dream while they're still awake, because the brain will just force itself to dream because it's part of its way of staying healthy. And they will sometimes hallucinate and so on. So those things were happening to me enough and intensely enough that we thought we need to investigate this more, because it somehow occurred to me that perhaps the way to adjust behavior is to cut that up too. And how do you cut it up? You can cut it up with ritual, sometimes repetition to the point of exhaustion and to the point of not thinking, so that something else comes through.
In 1981, P-Orridge and Christofferson moved on to form not only the band Psychic Television, or PTV, but also a network called the Temple of Psychic Youth, or TOPY. The idea was to merge their artistic expressions, previously mainly heard through music, with video art and an experimental approach to magic. Inspired by British occult pioneers like Aleister Crowley and Austin Osman Spare, a poet and painter respectively, TOPY structured an immense output of writings, products, and philosophy, as well as recommended techniques for self-improvement. This mainly via a technique called sigillization, a mix between personal artistic expression and sexual activities. As TOPY and PTV were platforms rather than set groups, a number of collaborations were initiated with filmmakers like Derek Jarman, Sarith Wynne Evans, and John Maybury. Out of this environment, many celebrated musical projects also bloomed, like Coil and Current 93. The output was summed up by P-Orridge by the term occulture, which has since become a mainstream term in both philosophical and religious studies. Permeating everything was P-Orridge's appreciation of primordial tribal philosophy via art that in itself should always be charged with a potential for change.
The tradition that we're interested in is shamanic, magical art. You know, we came out of performance and noticed in performance that they were ritual events, no matter how they looked to the other people, and that sometimes we were having out-of-body experiences, psychedelic repercussions, and so on. And that was what made me go private in 1976 after the Leica performance by COUM, where we just decided to go for broke and had blood enemas and milk and piss enemas and vomited and licked it up and sliced my arm, etc., etc. It was that classic, where else can you go? You know, you could go fine art like Chris Burden and say it wasn't gratuitous, it was all very considered. Or you can die. Or you can look for why that drive is in you. And what is it that draws you back over and over again to do expression of any kind in a way that the word we would immediately use would be ritual. You know, we thought back to prehistoric times. How did art begin? What was the real origin of art? And it was magical. You know, the wise person or the oldest person of a clan would remember all the stories to pass on, so they were a librarian in a sense. And also they were doing things visually and with sound and costume and sand paintings and shrines, literally to make the sun come back again, because for tens of thousands of years proto-humans didn't know that the sun would come back. How could they? So they would develop rituals to bring the sun back, and of course the shaman would always bring the sun back, therefore the shaman must be greatly empowered, and got a lot of kudos for that, for bringing mornings. And also it was functional. Why did you need to even do that? Because you didn't know that the seasons would come back. You had no concept of human linear time. So everything, every single morning when you awoke, was about trying to maintain continuity in order to survive. And it was also a spectacle that unified a clan. It could be part of initiations after puberty, all these different aspects of biological life and geographical life and the linearity of time. They all played into the origins of art. And so our passage began because when we first came across Dada and Surrealism, it's funny to think back, but it was to avoid being beaten up at school. You know, if you were a librarian for the school, you could stay in the library all lunchtime, and that would mean no one could come in and attack you. And so to avoid being attacked every day, we joined the librarians of the school and really got into putting things in exact alphabetical order, neat, tidy, easy to re-find, all that stuff, which we do to this day. And then we came across a book on Dada and Surrealism, and there's Max Ernst's collages using old engravings. And we were just, it was one of those eureka moments. You know, oh God, it doesn't have to look like anything you've seen or experienced. You can create worlds, intentions, characters, archetypes, and include them in the work. But we also were fascinated by the lives of the artists. And we've found over decades now that the biographies and autobiographies of the artists that we admire, or did admire, are crucial to whether or not we can appreciate the work. So that was the path we chose. We thought art has to be about your life. Your life has to be about the art, the act of creation. Comprehension by others is the least important aspect. You do things that touch you and feel symbolically powerful to you. You look for potency, and the reclamation of your right to create and dream and reassess and adjust and rebuild consensus reality as you see fit. It's your absolute right. And so my interest in art to this day is, can it still and will it still make things happen? We believe it can and will. Maybe not the things themselves, but they're just the tip of the iceberg of the way of thinking. They represent the means of perception, and that's what we're changing. How people perceive the world, how people perceive the interactions of the world between power and ignorance, between fear of the unknown and exploration of the unknown. The great artists, the great thinkers, the great magicians, and the great leaders of tribes, they're the ones who were not afraid to move into the unknown. On behalf of who? Their people. But to me, in this day and age, with a world that's unified with the internet and computers and God knows what, that means that the artist is there to represent and pull all people into a new world. It's a huge, huge responsibility. It's also the most exciting game in town. That's for sure.
Remove the barriers between your energy, your intuition and body, is a transmission of energy. There are no media, there are only transmissions expressed in a way that they demand, and we have to let them occur. Life is a search for temporary definitions, for arbitrary statements and words, fixing ourselves for a moment in a thing called life. But it's non-existent. It's a paradox of time, and there is no reason, for time neither begins nor ends, but loops around, repeating yourself until perhaps you learn something. Life requires being afraid, being uncertain in a special relationship with what other people call reality. Life is transmissions of your thoughts and your love and your open hearts and your ways of giving generously. It is not something precise.
One of the things we say the most often when we're giving talks at universities and so on, we stress over and over and over again that there is no difference between life and art. And when we say art, we include mysticism and so on in that the means of perception and the day-to-day activities of people are inextricably and totally linked. And we worked for a while with a Shinaapache shaman, Nadaste, Nomad as he was also known. And he said, it was interesting, he said in their language there's no word for death, but they substitute the word separation. And that is a really profound way of thinking of things, because that when you look at the world outside, then you're at this moment where we're separated from the earth itself. There's concrete here, there's glass here. We're separated from people in other places in the world. We're separated from the weather. All those are little deaths. And so most of us spend our lives in a downpour of various forms of death, separation from even those we love. And one of the great jobs of anyone who's trying to think and share ideas is to become inclusive instead of exclusive, to include other people, to include daily objects, to take everything as potentially significant. So what is this, a prophecy? Is this a gift from the future that was made in the past? What are all these stories that link with this? They're all part of this web of connection. So everything is connected. That's another of the things that we tend to believe. And also when we look at art, talking of art, the first question we usually ask is, what's the story? What is this telling me? Most of the time it's not telling me anything. And that's what Brian Geising called deceptual art. So that's something else that's very deeply ingrained, is what's the story? What are we learning from this? Nomad, the Native American, used to say, there are three questions when you look at something. Is this giving me something I didn't have before? Is this giving my community, my tribe, my family something that it didn't have before? Is this giving the world something that it didn't have before? And if it's not doing those things, it has no value. And his face is banal as hunger, and I'm laying here longer. It's a low-seed replication. So we replicate, don't we? Don't we? We make more of us, don't we? Don't we? We make lots of us, don't we? Don't we? We make more of us, don't we? Those who came before have gone away. They rot away. Those who are here now, they rot away, rot away. And all who come after rot away, rot away.
Inspired by the Cutups of Burroughs and Gysin, and the reconstructional attitude of many of the surrealists, P-Orridge started making collages early on. During the mail art days, the works became postcards. During the TG period, visual propaganda in the so-called information war. During the Topi era, distinctly magical sigils to manifest specific goals. To cut up and reconstruct is basically the consistent method in P-Orridge's work. However, in terms of the actual collages, they were never intended to be displayed as traditional art pieces.
Well, as you know, we kept most of the art activity hidden for 30 years. To make collages, to paint, to create objects was my relaxation time. And it was a really big emotional wrench to make the collages available. A lot of them are very intimate, a lot of them are such obscure British stroke Genesis in jokes that a lot of people probably miss it completely. So we were concerned that the language of our collages, the references, the very obscure and oblique aspects of them, and what they meant to me in terms of certain places in life. Some of them were just aesthetic experiments, but a lot of them were the exploration of the self again. Take the body out of the body, put it in Polaroids, reassemble it, and discover it looks like an alien baby's head. But interestingly, when we did the exhibition of collages, 30 years had been cut up, and since then, because that was when we kind of re-entered formally the art world, the sigils are the ones that don't sell, the ones that are actually clearly sigils. Nobody's bought any of them.
Why do you think that is?
They don't understand them, and they're probably a little afraid of them, and they don't fit any existing art aesthetic. They're not meant to look pretty, they're not meant to be finished, they're not made to be inside a frame. They're deeply intimate, which is frightening to a lot of people. They don't know the language. It's an alien language, it's an alien landscape. That's something we've noticed, and it's obviously significant. They get to They can follow us to the point of political satire, collages of the Queen and so on. But when it gets to direct magic, they shut off. It's interesting.
After moving to America in the early 1990s, P-Orridge and partner Lady J. Breyer created a new joint entity called Breyer P-Orridge and set out on an unprecedented exploratory quest. In order to erase gender boundaries, they both went through reconstructive surgery to look more like each other. The project or concept was called Pandrogyny. The work on the body and with the body that P-Orridge had previously only experimented with alone now took on radical proportions as the couple modified their bodies and thereby, according to the alchemical theories behind the project, their minds and attitudes.
DNA is an evolutionary parasite, and our bodies are merely the host environment in a symbiotic relationship with it. Our species replicates as much to perpetuate DNA as to perpetuate the species. Hence, one playful linguistic Breyer P-Orridge slogan, DNA AND.
In fact, we see the I of our consciousness as a fictional assembly or collage that resides in the environment of the body. One of the central themes of our work is the malleability of physical and behavioral identity. The body is used by the mind as a logo for the self before we are able to speak language. It is almost a holographic doll, constructed by outside expectations even before our body is born.
So that's something we would love to do, is work with a very friendly scientist who could propose things like we would love to have gills so we could live underwater. Jay wanted to have fur and horns like a deer, you know. She said she'd wanted horns since she could remember. So really what we're saying is we'd love to find genetic engineering and experimental science, biology, that opened up new options and vistas of other beings to be physically, to push it further and say that the human body, A, it's not finished, B, it's not sacred, it's just stuff. What matters is the mind is who you are, and really push everybody's concept of what a human body might be, especially as we do believe that it's our right and our destiny as a species to move into space, just like Brian Geisen said. At first we were skeptical, but having gone through 20 years of really rigorous debate with Lady J, it became apparent that they were absolutely right. There's no point in us being here to just repeat ourselves and just create more and more and more problems through lack of resources or greed of resources, fake economic systems, you know, totalitarian capitalism as we call it, that we have to move out into the other apparent universes, not necessarily even to colonize, but to explore. very much like Star Trek, just to go to see what's there, to experience different forms of being, existence, whatever you might call it.
In 2007, Lady J died, which was naturally a terrible blow for P-Orridge, but also for the project itself. In the usual spirit of determination and consistency, P-Orridge has kept their ideas alive in an attempt to keep fighting gender stereotypes and honor the memory of an invaluable partner. Even the most grim and dire turns of events can be used for positive, creative and constructive purposes, P-Orridge argues.
And that's been an amazingly positive incentive, which is just, as you know, live every day as if it's the last day that you live, and your entire life will be based on judging that day. And the same with work. That one should always try and make work as complex, deep, and strong as possible, because it could be the last thing you say. And it's amazing, much more so in Western societies, that people have somehow hypnotized themselves into the idea that they are not the one that's going to die. Places, as you know, like Nepal and India and so on, they have a much more integrated concept of death. It's part of daily life. If you live in even Kathmandu, you see all the people's bodies burning and being swept out into the river. And it really comes home, that you're just stuff. It's burnt, swept away like dirt, and that's it. So, who were you? Who were you? Where are you now? Are you anywhere? It was going to Nepal and meeting the Tibetans that convinced me and Jay that existentialism is not enough. There are too many other phenomena that contradict it. Just like Darwinism is a very, very deeply flawed concept. There is so much it does not explain and can't explain. So, yeah, that's been our life. Trying to learn how to make every second precious. What makes me happy? Very little since Lady J dropped her body, to be honest. Truly happy. We get a small amount of happiness out of being vindicated. The Tate Britain have now bought 2 pieces of art and sent a letter saying that they're being put into their national collection of important modern art, which is amazing. And then Robert Wilson, who did Einstein on the Beach, the famous 8 or 24-hour opera, whatever it was, he finally bought Boaz, which is 3 plexiglass photographs of my teeth going from normal teeth to gold in a column relating to the Freemason column. And the Louvre in Paris have dedicated a room to articles from his art collection. And our piece is in the Louvre. So we have a piece of art in the Louvre. We have art in the Tate Britain. And we have art in the Beaubourg in Paris. An installation. So that it's not so much exactly happiness, but it's nice to feel that you were right, that what you were trying to say and do has finally sunk in. Of course, they've only got to the 70s. That means they're still 45 years behind in terms of concepts, but it's a beginning. That gives me a moment of real happiness, just to see that the process that we began so long ago not only still works, but it's getting, in a sense, to me, more and more accurate, more and more seamless. When we talked yesterday at the Brooklyn Museum, we were showing collages, and we actually stopped and said, by the way, just so you know, we only use scissors and glue. Scissors and stick glue. And somebody went, really? I went, yeah. And we said, yes, we know. Lots of you will ask me, what software do you use? And the answer is, we don't. It's all done with scissors and glue. And we have no reason to change. Because it's a skill that we've mastered, And just like it takes painters decades to feel they've got their painting working correctly, it's been like that with collages, and artworks. So we get happiness out of completing artworks, of seeing something and making it materialize.
Genesis P-Orridge's vast body of work keeps on growing. Increased interest, not only within the art world, but also within an academic environment, leads to invitations to lecture about life, philosophy, and art. Inspiration and influence merge to effect change in ever-revolving cycles of experience and shared results.
We've always had this belief since we joined a commune in 1968 in London called the Exploding Galaxy. And the thing we took away from that the most, apart from the joy of sharing everything, was this idea that we received that everybody has a genius factor. Everybody. And that if you can just encourage people to believe in themselves, and you can give them the skills to start to explore different ways of expressing themselves, then no matter what it is, whether they're just the best person at sweeping the floor in the world or the greatest artist, it doesn't matter, it's that they're a genius. And we still believe in that to this day. That's something we've always tried to encourage. And of course that leads to creativity. There's no question. I mean, it could sound egocentric, but just the evidence is such. Somebody came up to me at the airport when we arrived here and said, are you Genesis? And we said, yes. And they said, oh, you've influenced what I do and you've changed my life, and thank you. People say that a lot. And other artists in New York, young artists, also say that it's been a big influence. Interestingly, recently, one person we know very well said that they were in love with someone, and that the reason that they were able to really truly be in love for the first time was through my example and Jay's of being 100% committed, regardless of the fear of failure. And they said, it was you that made me feel that I should just surrender and give myself to what I really felt. And as a result, my sex life has been incredible compared to anything before, and my life is happier than it's ever been, but that was because of you, which is about as good as it gets.